Close your eyes. Imagine a forest. Not a tame, managed forest of paths and signposts. A wild forest, ancient. The trees enormous and close together, their roots tangled over mossy stones, their canopy so thick that the sky is almost invisible above. The light that filters through is green and gold and shifting, like light underwater. This is Gaul, the land that will one day be France and Belgium and Switzerland and parts of Germany. But right now, in the year 58 BC, it is none of those things. It is a land of rivers and hills and deep dark forests, of hilltop fortresses and sacred groves, of a people who have lived here for centuries and who believe with every reason that they will go on living here for centuries more. They are wrong. Tonight we tell one of the darkest stories in the ancient world, a story that Dan Carlin, whose extraordinary podcast brought this history back to the attention it deserves, described with the word that hangs over everything we will discuss tonight. Holocaust. Not a word used lightly, not a word applied carelessly, but a word that the numbers demand. In 8 years, from 58 BC to 50 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar conducted a military campaign in Gaul that, according to ancient sources, killed 1 million people and enslaved another million, out of a total population of perhaps 3 million. 2/3 of an entire people, killed or enslaved in less than a decade. By one man, in pursuit of personal ambition. And that man wrote the history of what he did himself, and it became one of the most celebrated pieces of Latin prose in the history of the language. Tonight we try to read between the lines of what Caesar wrote, to hear the voices he didn't record, to understand what was lost and how it was lost and who was responsible. So settle in, let the forest close around you, let the fire burn low, and let the ancient world carry you gently to sleep. Part 1. The world of the Celts. To understand what was destroyed, you first need to understand what it was. The Celts were not the primitive, disorganized barbarians that the Romans described, and that popular imagination has often accepted. They were one of the dominant cultures of Iron Age Europe, spread across an enormous territory that stretched from the British Isles in the west to central Turkey in the east, from the Iberian Peninsula in the south to the Rhine and beyond in the north. They were skilled metalworkers. The swords and talks and decorated objects they produced were among the finest artistic achievements of the ancient world. They were farmers and traders, operating within networks of commerce that stretched across the continent. They built hilltop fortresses, oppida, the Romans called them, that were sophisticated urban centers, housing thousands of people with organized marketplaces, craft workshops, and administrative structures. They were, in short, a civilization, not identical to Rome, not organized in the same ways, but a civilization nonetheless. The Celtic peoples of Gaul were organized into tribes, dozens of them, each with its own territory, its own leadership structure, its own alliances and rivalries. Some tribes were governed by councils of nobles. Others had elected leaders, magistrates who served for set terms, with rules against one family monopolizing power that would not have looked out of place in a Roman constitution. The Helvetii tribe, for example, burned to death anyone who attempted to restore a monarchy. The parallels with Roman republican values were real, and the Romans knew it. At the heart of Celtic society was the Druid class. The Druids were simultaneously priests, judges, historians, poets, teachers, and political advisors. They held enormous authority that crossed tribal boundaries in ways that political power did not. When the Druids said something was sacred, all the tribes listened. When they mediated a dispute, their judgment was accepted. They met every year in a sacred place at the center of Gaul, the lands of the Conquests tribe, which Caesar would later describe as the heart of the whole country. There they settled disputes between tribes, transmitted the accumulated knowledge of generations, and maintained the religious and cultural framework that held Celtic civilization together. They did not write things down. This was a deliberate choice, not evidence of ignorance but a religious decision. The sacred knowledge was too important to be committed to paper, where it might be captured, corrupted, or misused. It lived in human memory, passed from teacher to student across generations in an educational process that could take 20 years to complete. This had a consequence that the Druids cannot have foreseen. When the culture that carried this knowledge was destroyed, the knowledge was destroyed with it. There are no Celtic accounts of the Gallic Wars. The people who experienced the conquest left no written record of what it felt like. Everything we know comes from the Romans, primarily from Caesar himself, who had obvious reasons to present events in a particular light. We are trying to understand a genocide from the perpetrator's autobiography. That is the challenge at the heart of this story. Part 2, Julius Caesar. Before we follow Caesar into Gaul, we need to understand who he was and why he went there. Julius Caesar, in 59 BC, was a man in serious trouble. He was one of the most politically gifted figures in Roman history, charming, brilliant, generous with money he didn't have, capable of inspiring extraordinary loyalty in the people around him. He had spent decades climbing the Roman political ladder, accumulating debts, making allies, winning popularity with the Roman people through spectacular games and public works funded by borrowed money. He had also, along the way, made enemies, powerful enemies, men who would, if they got the chance, prosecute him for the various legal irregularities that had accompanied his rise to power. The Roman legal system had one important feature that Caesar needed to exploit. A Roman magistrate holding a military command, an imperium, could not be prosecuted while that command continued. The moment his command ended and he became a private citizen again, he was vulnerable. Caesar needed a war that would last long enough and generate enough wealth and glory to transform his political position completely. A war that would make him so powerful, so wealthy, so militarily dominant, that his enemies would no longer be able to touch him. He found it in Gaul. In 59 BC, as part of the political arrangements of the first triumvirate, his alliance with Pompey and Crassus, the other two great power brokers of the late Roman Republic, Caesar was appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. The following year, Transalpine Gaul was added. the province Rome already controlled in the south of what is now France. From this base, he could look north at the vast, unconquered territories beyond the Roman frontier, at the wealth waiting to be plundered, at the slaves waiting to be taken, at the glory waiting to be won, and at the legal protection that continued military command would provide. He needed a justification. Rome had rules. You couldn't simply invade neighboring peoples without cause. You needed a casus belli, a reason, an invitation or a provocation or a threat. Caesar was very good at finding reasons. Part 3, the Helvetii and the first pretext. The first pretext arrived in the form of the Helvetii. The Helvetii were a Celtic tribe living in what is now Switzerland, a highland people, hemmed in by mountains and forests, who had decided in 61 BC to migrate en masse to the more fertile lands of western Gaul. This was not an unusual thing in the ancient world. Peoples moved, climates changed, better land was available elsewhere. The Helvetii had been planning this migration for years, stockpiling food, burning their villages behind them so there would be no going back, gathering a force of perhaps 360,000 people, of whom perhaps 90,000 were fighting men. They asked permission to cross Roman territory on their migration route. Caesar refused. He then watched as they found an alternate route and used their movement as a pretext for military action. A Roman ally, the Aedui tribe, complained that the Helvetii were raiding their territory. Caesar responded. In the summer of 58 BC, he engaged the Helvetii in a series of battles that culminated in a decisive Roman victory. The Helvetii were crushed, killed in enormous numbers, the survivors forced to return to their homeland. Caesar had won his first Gallic victory, his first justification for the campaign. But now he was in Gaul, and he was looking around at everything that surrounded him. The next pretext was already forming. Part 4, the German threat and the expanding war. The second justification for Caesar's presence in Gaul came from the east. Germanic tribes had been crossing the Rhine and settling in Gallic territory, most importantly under a leader named Ariovistus, king of the Suebi, who had settled a large force in the territory of the Sequani tribe and was demanding tribute, hostages, and land. Some Gallic tribes, those who had originally invited Ariovistus in as a military ally against their neighbors, were now deeply regretting that invitation. Caesar presented himself as the protector of Gaul against Germanic encroachment. This was not entirely dishonest. Germanic pressure on Gaul was real, and the Romans genuinely feared the prospect of large Germanic populations settling west of the Rhine. The memory of the Cimbri and Teutons, Germanic tribes who had terrorized northern Italy over a century earlier before being destroyed by the Roman general Marius, was still vivid in Roman consciousness. But Caesar also, in Dan Carlin's framing, exaggerated the threat dramatically. He needed the threat to be large enough to justify a large military response. The larger the response, the more glory, the more wealth, the more continued command. He confronted Ariovistus diplomatically first. The meeting went badly. Roman sources describe Ariovistus as contemptuous and threatening. Whether this was true or whether Caesar wanted it to go badly is impossible to determine from the sources we have. War followed. Caesar defeated Ariovistus and drove the Germanic forces back across the Rhine. 2 victories, 2 justifications, 2 seasons of campaigning. And he was just getting started. Part 5. The Belgae and the Enslaved. In 57 BC, Caesar turned north. The Belgae, a large confederation of tribes occupying what is now Belgium and northern France, were, by Roman accounts, the most warlike of the Gallic peoples. They had heard what had happened to the Helvetii and to Ariovistus. They understood what Caesar's arrival in Gaul meant for them. They decided to act before he acted. A coalition of Belgic tribes assembled and marched south to confront the Roman army. Caesar met them. After initial maneuvering and skirmishing, the Belgic coalition fell apart, the difficulty that always plagued Celtic resistance to Rome. Tribal confederations were hard to hold together. Individual tribes had different interests, different threat perceptions, different relationships with Rome. The temptation to make a separate deal, to preserve your own tribe at the expense of the common effort, was always present. The coalition dissolved. Caesar dealt with the tribes individually, which was always easier. But one tribe refused to simply submit. The Nervii. The Nervii were, by Caesar's own account, a tribe of extraordinary ferocity and martial pride. They supposedly had a rule against importing wine or any luxury goods, believing that such things softened men and made them less fit for war. Whether this is true or Caesar's romanticization of the enemy he was about to destroy, we cannot know. At the Battle of the Sabis River, fought on the banks of a river in what is now Belgium, the Nervii launched a surprise attack that came close to destroying Caesar's army. The Roman legions, caught in the middle of making camp, were attacked before they had time to form proper battle order. For a critical period, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Caesar himself reportedly grabbed a shield from a passing soldier and fought in the front line to steady his men. The Romans recovered. Their training, their discipline, their ability to reorganize under pressure saved them. The Nervii were destroyed, killed in such numbers that Caesar's account, if accurate, describes something close to the annihilation of a people. He writes that the tribe was reduced from 60,000 fighting men to 500. Whether those numbers are accurate, we cannot say. Caesar's figures are notoriously unreliable. He had every incentive to exaggerate both the strength of his enemies and the scale of his victories. But something terrible happened to the Nervii at the Sabis River. That much is clear. Part 6. The Pattern. By the end of 57 BC, Caesar had conducted 3 major campaigns in Gaul. He had won every engagement. He had sent dispatches back to Rome describing his victories, and Rome had responded with extraordinary honors, 20 days of thanksgiving, the longest ever decreed by the Senate at that point. And a pattern was emerging that would define the next several years. Caesar would find or manufacture a pretext for military action against a tribe. He would engage them militarily. He would win. He almost always won, because the Roman army was genuinely better trained, better equipped, better organized, better at logistics and siege warfare than anything the Gallic tribes could field against it. And then would come what the Romans called bellum Romanum, Roman-style war, total war. War that did not end with the defeat of the enemy's army but continued until the enemy was broken completely. Villages burned, crops destroyed, the civilian population killed or enslaved. The enslavement was not incidental. It was the economic engine of the whole enterprise. Slaves were the most valuable commodity in the Roman economy. A healthy adult male could be sold for significant sums. 100,000 slaves, a number Caesar would take from a single campaign, represented an extraordinary fortune. Caesar was deeply in debt. He needed money. The Gallic campaigns provided it in the most direct way imaginable. Every village taken was a source of slaves. Every tribe crushed was a source of revenue. And the debt that had driven him into Gaul in the first place was slowly being paid down by the bodies and the freedom of the Celtic people. Part 7. The Druids and what was lost. Let us pause here and think about what was being destroyed. Not just lives, though the lives matter above everything else, but a culture, a civilization, a way of being human in the world. The Druids were the keepers of everything the Celts knew and believed and valued. Their knowledge, accumulated across generations, transmitted orally in a process that took 20 years, covered astronomy, philosophy, religious practice, history, law, medicine, poetry. Caesar himself writes about them with a grudging respect that is unusual in his accounts of Gallic institutions. He describes them as highly educated men who studied for decades, who taught the transmigration of souls, the belief that the soul survived death and was reborn, and who held enormous political authority. They were exempt from military service and from taxation. Disputes between tribes were brought to them for resolution. Their judgment was final. Those who refused to accept their rulings were excommunicated from religious practice, which in Celtic society was a form of social death. The sacred groves where they performed their ceremonies were places of enormous spiritual significance. Ancient trees, maintained for centuries, the accumulated holiness of generations of worship embedded in the landscape. Caesar destroyed them. He cut down the sacred groves. He killed the Druids or drove them into hiding into the western edges of the Celtic world, to Britain and Ireland, where Roman power had not yet reached. The knowledge they carried did not survive in written form because it had never been written down. It survived only in the memories of the people who carried it. When those people were killed or enslaved or scattered, the knowledge died with them. We know almost nothing about what the Druids actually believed, because Caesar and the other Roman sources were describing what they saw from the outside. The inside, the actual content of 20 years of training, the specific beliefs and practices and histories, is gone, permanently, irrecoverably. The Celtic Holocaust was not just a physical destruction of people. It was a cultural destruction that erased a civilization's inner life so completely that we cannot even fully mourn what was lost. because we don't know what it was. Part 8. Ambience and the Worst Defeat. The year 54 BC brought Caesar his worst moment in Gaul. A leader named Ambiorix, chief of the Eburones tribe in what is now northeastern Belgium, led a rebellion that caught the Romans badly off guard. Caesar had dispersed his legions into winter quarters across a wide area of Gaul, because the region had suffered a bad harvest, and concentrating them in one place would have created a food supply problem. Ambiorix approached the commander of one of these isolated winter camps, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, with a warning. He claimed, with every appearance of friendly concern, that a massive Germanic invasion was coming and that the Romans should move their camp to safer ground before they were overwhelmed. It was a lie, a carefully constructed, brilliantly executed lie. Sabinus believed it. He convinced his co-commander, Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, who was skeptical, to march the legion out of the camp and into the forest. The Eburones were waiting in the forest. A Roman legion and a half, perhaps 15,000 men, was ambushed in a narrow valley. The Celts attacked from the high ground on both sides. The Romans, caught in marching order, unable to form a proper battle line, were cut to pieces. Cotta was killed fighting. Sabinus attempted to negotiate and was killed at the parley. The survivors retreated to a hilltop and held out through the night, and then, unable to face another day of it, most of them killed themselves rather than be taken prisoner. Perhaps a handful escaped to carry the news to Caesar. An entire Roman army destroyed. Caesar does not dwell on this in his account. He moves past it quickly, but it clearly shook him. The subsequent campaigns against the Eburones were conducted with a ferocity that was unusual even by Caesar's standards. He explicitly ordered the complete destruction of the tribe, every person killed, every building burned, every animal slaughtered. He wanted nothing left. The Eburones essentially disappear from the historical record after this. Whether they were truly exterminated or whether survivors fled and merged with other tribes, we do not know. Ambiorix himself escaped. He was never captured. He disappeared into the forests of the north and was never found. Dan Carlin lingers on this figure, the man who outfoxed Caesar, who destroyed a Roman army through cleverness rather than force, who refused to become a trophy of Roman conquest. There is something almost satisfying about his disappearance. One man who slipped through the net. Part 9. The Rising Tide. By 53 BC, something was changing in Gaul. The tribes that had initially cooperated with Rome, hoping to use Roman power against their rivals, hoping to manage the occupation without full submission, were beginning to understand that cooperation was not going to save them. Caesar's demands were constant: grain, hostages, soldiers for his campaigns, submission to Roman authority in matters of internal tribal politics. The Gallic nobles who had allied with Rome were finding that the alliance required more and more of them and gave them less and less in return. The Druids met in the sacred lands of the Carnutes, the annual gathering that was the spiritual and legal heart of Celtic civilization. The threat to those lands, to those meeting places, to the whole framework of Druidic authority, was becoming existential. And in the winter of 53 BC, something that had never happened before in Gaul began to happen. The tribes began to talk to each other about united resistance. The man who would turn that conversation into action was a young Arvernian noble. His name was Vercingetorix. Part 10, Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix is one of the great figures of ancient history, and one of the most tragic. He was the son of Celtulus, chief of the Arverni, who had been killed by his own people for attempting to make himself king. Vercingetorix grew up in a culture that hated monarchy, in a family that had been destroyed by the attempt to establish one. He was young when he began his revolt, probably in his late 20s. He was charismatic, militarily gifted, and politically brilliant in a way that was unusual for a Gallic leader of his time. What made him unusual was his understanding of the fundamental problem that had allowed Caesar to destroy the Gallic tribes one by one. Division. The Gauls had never been able to unite. Every time a coalition formed against Rome, individual tribes defected, made separate deals, prioritized their own survival over the collective resistance. Caesar had exploited this with devastating consistency. Vercingetorix understood that the only way to defeat Rome was to prevent Caesar from using Gallic food supplies, to deny the Roman army the ability to live off the land it was conquering. He proposed a scorched earth strategy of breathtaking ruthlessness. Burn the towns, burn the crops, burn the storehouses, deny Caesar everything. Make Gaul ungovernable not by fighting the Romans in pitched battle, which the Celts consistently lost, but by making it impossible for the Roman army to feed itself. It was the right strategy. Even Caesar seems to acknowledge this obliquely in his account. The scorched earth campaign came closer to defeating him than any pitched battle had. But it required the Gallic leaders to order the destruction of their own people's homes, their own people's food, their own people's accumulated wealth. It required a level of sacrifice and unity and long-term thinking that was extraordinarily difficult to maintain. Vercingetorix managed it for a time. Part 11, Geogoviae. The spring and summer of 52 BC produced the most dramatic reversal of Caesar's career in Gaul. After a winter of crisis, Caesar had been caught on the wrong side of the Alps when the revolt began, and had to make a desperate winter crossing through the snow to reach his army. He moved against Vercingetorix with his usual speed and aggression. Vercingetorix avoided pitched battle. He harassed Caesar's supply lines. He threatened the territory of Caesar's Gallic allies, forcing Caesar to divide his forces. He kept moving. Caesar needed a decisive engagement. He needed to break the revolt before it spread further, or before his own supply situation became critical. He made a mistake. At Gergovia, the Arvernian capital, a hilltop fortress of enormous natural strength, Caesar attempted a direct assault. His legions stormed the slopes under heavy fire, made initial progress, then were thrown back with serious losses. He retreated. It was the only clear tactical defeat of Caesar's Gallic campaigns. A Roman army under Julius Caesar had attacked a Gallic position and been driven off. The effect across Gaul was electric. If Caesar could be beaten here, he could be beaten elsewhere. Tribes that had been wavering threw their support behind Vercingetorix. The coalition grew. Even the Aedui, Caesar's most consistent Gallic ally, the tribe whose complaints about the Helvetia had given Caesar his first pretext for intervention, defected to Vercingetorix. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed like the Gauls might actually win. Part 12, Alesia. And then came Alesia. The Battle of Alesia in September 52 BC is one of the most remarkable military engagements in the ancient world. Caesar's account of it is one of the finest pieces of military writing ever produced, which is part of why it is so difficult to read critically. The prose is so compelling, the narrative so well crafted, that you find yourself admiring the victor before you remember to mourn the defeated. Vercingetorix retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a natural stronghold, nearly impregnable, rising from the surrounding plain in a way that made direct assault almost impossible. Caesar did not assault it directly. He surrounded it. What Caesar built around Alesia was one of the greatest feats of military engineering in the ancient world. An inner wall, 11 miles of fortifications, encircling the entire hilltop, cutting off the garrison from escape or resupply. And then, as the Gallic relief army began to assemble on the surrounding plains, an outer wall, another 14 miles, facing outward to protect the besieging Romans from attack. Caesar's army was building walls in both directions simultaneously, while simultaneously fighting off sorties from the garrison and attacks from the growing relief force outside. The engineering was astonishing. The physical effort required was almost impossible to imagine. Tens of thousands of men digging, cutting timber, constructing towers and camps and supply depots, while remaining combat-ready at all times. Inside Alesia, the situation was deteriorating. The garrison had enough food for 30 days. The relief army was assembling, by Caesar's account, an enormous force drawn from tribes across Gaul. The strategy was to catch the Romans between the garrison breaking out and the relief force breaking in, crushing Caesar's army between two Gallic forces. It was the right strategy. It came close to working. The final battle was desperate and bloody. The Gallic relief force found weak points in Caesar's outer wall. The garrison attacked simultaneously. For a time, the Romans were fighting in multiple places at once, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. And then Caesar personally led his cavalry reserves in a decisive charge that broke the relief force's momentum. The outer attack collapsed. Without hope of relief, the garrison's resistance crumbled. Vercingetorix made his last decision. He would not allow his men to be killed for him. He rode out of Alesia and surrendered to Caesar personally, riding into the Roman camp in full armor, circling Caesar's tribunal, then dismounting and sitting at Caesar's feet. Caesar sent him to Rome in chains. He would sit in a Roman prison for 6 years, kept alive as a trophy, displayed in Caesar's triumph in Rome in 46 BC, paraded through the streets of the city he had fought to keep free of Rome, and then quietly, efficiently executed. He was perhaps 36 years old. Part 13. The Aftermath. The fall of Alesia did not end the war. Scattered resistance continued into 50 BC, 2 more years of brutal, grinding suppression. The last significant holdout was a fortress called Uxellodunum in southwestern Gaul, where a group of Gallic warriors held out long enough that Caesar's patience finally ran out entirely. When Uxellodunum fell, Caesar ordered the hands cut off every man who had borne arms against Rome. He did not kill them. He let them live as walking examples, as permanent, visible reminders of what resistance to Roman power cost. Men missing both hands, unable to work, unable to fight, unable to do anything except exist as monuments to Caesar's message. The ancient sources record this without particular comment. It was, within the framework of Roman warfare, a relatively restrained punishment. Caesar was being merciful by Roman standards. That tells you something about Roman standards. By 50 BC, Gaul was pacified. The word pacified does a great deal of work in the history of conquest. It means that the people with weapons have stopped fighting the people with other weapons. It says nothing about what has happened to the people who had no weapons. The women, the children, the farmers, the craftspeople, the Druids. It says nothing about the million dead, about the million enslaved, about the cultures and traditions and accumulated knowledge that had been erased from the world. Part 14. The Numbers. Let us sit with the numbers for a moment, because Dan Carlin, in his account of this story, insists on sitting with them. He insists on not letting the magnitude of what happened be dissolved into the comfortable abstraction of ancient history. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, give figures for the Gallic wars that are staggering. 1 million dead, 1 million enslaved, 800 towns destroyed. Now, the ancient sources are not reliable in their precise numbers. Ancient historians did not have access to census records, and they had every reason to make the numbers impressive. The actual figures were almost certainly different from the recorded ones. But even the scholars who are most skeptical about the specific numbers agree that the scale of destruction was enormous. Celtic archaeologist Barry Cunliffe, one of the leading experts on the ancient Celts, has noted that even using the lowest estimates for Gaul's population, Caesar killed roughly a third of the people and enslaved another third. 2/3 of a population killed or enslaved in 8 years. Dan Carlin raises the question that haunts this entire story. Is this genocide? The Romans would have rejected the word. They had a framework bellum Romanum, Roman-style war, that justified total war against peoples who resisted Roman authority. In Roman legal thinking, this was not genocide. It was the natural consequence of rebellion against legitimate power. But consider the question from the other direction. If a modern government killed a third of an ethnic population and enslaved another third, destroyed their religious sites, executed their religious leaders, burned their cultural centers, and replaced their language with its own, what word would we use? The fact that it happened 2,000 years ago does not change the arithmetic. Part 15, Caesar's motives. Here is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Celtic Holocaust. It was not driven by ideology or by religion or by racial hatred. The Romans did not go into Gaul because they believed the Celts were subhuman. They went because one man needed money and power and legal protection from prosecution. Caesar's motivations were almost entirely personal. He needed the wealth from Gallic plunder to pay his debts. He needed the military command to protect himself from his political enemies. He needed the glory to improve his political position in Rome. He needed the slaves to sell. 1 million people died so that Julius Caesar could pay his bills and avoid prosecution. That is not a comfortable thought. It does not fit the framework of grand historical inevitability that we sometimes use to make ancient atrocities more bearable. It does not allow us to say, well, it was a clash of civilizations, and these things happen in history. It was greed. It was ambition. It was one man's personal calculation that the benefits to himself outweighed the costs to the people he was killing. Some Romans said so at the time. Cato, the great conservative senator, Caesar's most implacable political enemy, argued in the Senate that Caesar should be handed over to the Gauls in reparation for his crimes. He was not taken seriously, but he said it. The wealth flowing back to Rome from the Gallic campaigns was too attractive for many senators to examine the methods too closely. The moral accounting, as it always does, was left to history. Part 16. What Rome built on the ruins. Gaul became a Roman province. Within a generation, the process of Romanization had begun. Roman roads were built across the territory, the same roads that had military purposes but that also facilitated trade and communication in ways that transformed the economy. Roman cities grew on the sites of Gallic oppida. Latin was imposed as the language of administration, of law, of commerce. The Celtic languages of Gaul survived for several centuries in rural areas, but they were gradually replaced. By the early medieval period, they had largely disappeared from the continent, surviving only in the western edges, in Britain and in Brittany. The Druids were gone. Their sacred groves were gone. The oral traditions they had maintained for centuries were gone. What replaced them was Roman civilization, roads, cities, law, the Latin language that would eventually evolve into French. Caesar's conquest of Gaul created the geographical and cultural foundations of modern France. The country that would one day produce the Declaration of the Rights of Man, that would generate some of the most powerful ideas about human freedom and human dignity in the history of Western civilization. That country was built on the bones of the people Caesar destroyed. This is not a comfortable irony, but it is a real one. The language the French speak today is descended from the Latin Caesar brought. The roads of France still often follow the paths of Roman military roads. The cities, Paris, Lyon, Reims, Bordeaux, stand on the sites of Roman settlements built on the ruins of Celtic ones. History is not clean. It is not a story of the good replacing the bad, or the advanced replacing the primitive. It is the story of peoples and cultures colliding, and of the fact that what survives is not always what was best. Part 17. The Man Who Wrote the History. There is one final layer of this story that must be acknowledged. Caesar wrote his own account of the Gallic Wars, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico. 7 books covering 7 years of campaigning, written in clear, precise, elegant Latin that was recognized as a literary masterpiece from the moment it was published. It is still read today. It is still used to teach Latin in schools. It is still cited as a primary source for the history of this period. The man who killed 1,000,000 people wrote the history of their killing, and it became a classic of world literature. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this. The voice we hear most clearly when we try to understand the Celtic Holocaust is the voice of the man responsible for it. He presents himself as reasonable, as provoked, as responding to threats rather than creating them. He is generous in his praise of Gallic courage. He is matter-of-fact about the numbers of people killed or enslaved, mentioning them with the same detachment he applies to the weather or the terrain. He is, in other words, a brilliant propagandist, and we have been reading his propaganda for 2,000 years. Dan Carlin's great contribution, entitling his episode The Celtic Holocaust, and in making his audience sit with the human reality of what Caesar's elegant Latin describes, is to insist that we read between the lines, to ask, what did this look like from the other side? What did the Nervii experience at the Sabis River? What did the people of Alesia feel as the food ran out? What did the Gallic nobles think as they watched their sacred groves burn? We do not know, we cannot know. Those voices are gone. But the question matters. The asking of it matters. Because if we read Caesar's account without asking it, we become complicit in the same erasure that Caesar himself performed. We let the perpetrator's narrative stand unchallenged, because the victims left no written record and the perpetrator wrote beautifully. Closing the Forest AT Night. And so the story of the Celtic Holocaust comes to rest. 8 years, 1,000,000 dead, 1,000,000 enslaved, a civilization reduced to fragments, its inner life erased so completely that we still cannot fully reconstruct it. And the man responsible died as he lived in the center of power, surrounded by the results of his own ambition. Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC, on the floor of the Roman Senate. 23 stab wounds from 23 men who had decided that the power he had accumulated through the destruction of Gaul and the subsequent civil wars had made him too dangerous to live. He had spent a decade killing people to avoid prosecution. He was killed anyway. History has a kind of dark symmetry sometimes. But the 1,000,000 Gauls who died so that he could avoid his creditors never came back. The Druids who carried 20 years of accumulated knowledge in their memories never came back. The sacred groves never grew again. The forest is quiet now. Let the images settle, like leaves on still water. The ancient trees, dark and close. The firelight in a Gallic village on a winter night. The Druids in their sacred grove, passing knowledge from teacher to student in the language no one wrote down. Vercingetorix riding out of Alesia in his armor for the last time. Ambience disappearing into the forest, never found. Let the names grow quiet. Caesar, Vercingetorix, Ambiorix, the Nervii, the Helvetii, the Druids. There are no more battles tonight. No more walls to build. No more groves to burn. No more people to count. Only the ancient forest, and the wind moving through the trees that are still standing. And sleep. A soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.